Hello, folks, and thank you all so much for coming out to the second live Q&A in our Royal Family series with Shinan Govani. Over the next 20 minutes or so, Shinan and I are going to be running through the excellent questions that you sent us in response to his second session this week, looking at Edward and the abdication. Just a reminder before we begin that if you're going to stick around for our final Q&A of the morning at 11:30 a.m. with Laura Carlson, you're going to need to refresh your browser when we start that session at 11:30 a.m. So just click into on the URL at the top of your screen and hit enter or return. I also want to remind you that we're doing a video capture of all of these Q&As that we're going to share with you in the emails that are going out on Monday. So if any friends of yours were not able to make today's session, rest assured that they will have the opportunity to watch our Q&A at a later date. But in the meantime, it is, as always, an enormous pleasure to connect with Shinan. Please join me in giving him your warmest Curious Minds welcome. Welcome, Shinan.
Thank you, Will. Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing great. Always a pleasure to run through the life and times of the House of Windsor.
Yeah, we march on. Yes.
We march on. The march of time continues this week as we moved on from Queen Victoria into the drama surrounding Edward and Wallace and your great guest interview with Hugo Vickers. I'm going to jump right into it now. And the first question that we received comes from Deanie Cohen, who's tackling, I think, one of the enduring, most hotly debated questions surrounding Edward, and that is his apparent Nazi sympathies. So she writes, there's been a lot of debate over Edward's apparent acceptance of the Nazi regime. Shinan posed the question of what the map of Europe might look like today if Edward had not abdicated. But Hugo Vickers seemed to diminish the significance of any Nazi affiliation. The Netflix series The Crown showed Edward as being supportive of the Nazis, lending his royal persona to a visit to Germany, a meeting with Hitler, etc. Can Shinan say something about this? How serious were Edward's Nazi sympathies?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's a question that's both intrigued and baffled historians for decades. And for me, I guess it comes down to their personalities. Like, I'm not entirely sure, having read a fair bit about them, watched their interviews, how fixed Edward's opinions were about international relations. A lot of them seem sort of wafer thin, or like the stuff of cocktail party chatter that you would, that you would see play out in a Evelyn Waugh novel or something. And I'm not really sure how deep either of them particularly were when it came to these issues. But I will defer to a biography written by Wallace Simpson just last year by Anne Pasternak. This is kind of a revisionist look at Wallace, and she took a deep dive into this question. She talks about how all of this sort of speculation stems from, obviously, the trip that Edward made to Germany when he took Wallace there in 1937, where they hung out with Hitler. And by some accounts, we even see mention of this in The Crown, he gave full Nazi salutes. And there's also been rumors that there was a plan by Nazi officials to kidnap the Duke and reinstall him as a puppet king after an invasion of Britain. So that's intense. Was he a Nazi sympathizer, though? Anne Pasternak writes that she's watched the newsreels. He's waving to the crowd, but you can take one frame and it looks like a Nazi salute. She consulted historians of the period, and she writes, there's no evidence that they were Nazi sympathizers, and certainly there's no complete evidence for this rubbish that Wallace had an affair with a high-ranking Nazi official. And what's also interesting is that this whole sort of trip happened in a manner that's not entirely divorced from the personal sort of unspooling of this relationship. He actually wanted to take Wallis to Germany to give her this sort of grand welcome. Because as you can see from footage of that trip in 1937, Wallis was kind of treated like her Royal Highness in Germany. And when you think about Edward's woundedness from his family and how desperate he was to show Wallis that this was the life she was entitled to as his wife, it was like he came to it from this bizarre place of hurt and made a very foolish decision. Now, having said that, he was friends with people like Diana Maudsley, one of the Mitford sisters, who was the wife of the British fascist leader Oswald Maudsley. To what extent this just comes out to high society hanging out with other high society, we don't know. We know that in his autobiography years later, he spoke out against Hitler, and did he say some ill-advised things? Yes. But then Pasternak also writes that, remember, Edward was not academically bright or astute. And in one sense, he was modern, but he was also incredibly stupid in others. I'm sure after a few drinks, you could have said some very stupid and offensive things, unquote. So that's just a little bit of some of the context around this. I guess we'll never really know. But it's an intriguing question, of course.
Right. Yeah. Right. An intriguing question steeped in ambiguity, as so many of the key details surrounding Edward and Wallis are. And the next question we're going to discuss is another matter of much speculation relating to the private lives, the sex lives of Edward and Wallis. Jane Gilmore writes in to ask us about some interesting allegations about Edward and Wallis in the 2018 documentary Full Service: My Adventures in Hollywood and the Secret Lives of the Stars, which tells the story of Scott Bowers, who ran a famous gas station and underground referral service for Hollywood stars and other people for sexual rendezvous. Many were homosexual men who in the 1940s and 50s simply did not have the option of coming out. There's a documentary we screened at Hot Docs a couple years ago and received quite a bit of attention. So in the film, Bowers alleges that Edward and Wallis were both gay, and that although they definitely loved and were devoted to one another, their marriage and their time together was partly used as a way to cover up that fact. So Jane was very curious to hear your perspective on this, Shinan. Do you think Scotty Bowers' allegations are credible, or is this yet another one of the myths surrounding Wallis and Edward that can never be sort of fully what is the word I'm looking for? Fully documented or verified?
Substantiated. Yeah. I guess my short answer is yes, no, maybe. I've read the Scotty Bauer book. I've seen the documentary, and I mean, he has some very juicy allegations, not just about Edward and Wallis, but many Hollywood stars. But I think it's come out also, since the time he wrote that book, that he was a bit of a fabulist. So there's a little bit of fog around the extent to which how much was true and how much wasn't. There are a few things we do know. We know that Edward had many girlfriends and paramours even before Wallis, including this French courtesan, if you go back and do the deep dive. And do I think that he was sexually adventurous? Yeah. And was he a hedonist? Sure. I think that perhaps we don't even have the sexual vocabulary that to extend from our lens now to the way high society especially played out their lives back then. What's intriguing to me is that Wallis was obviously very partial to gay men. That was a lot of her set, especially later in life. It was people like Cecil Beaton and Somerset Maugham and Noel Coward, and then there was a much speculated sort of affair, but we don't know if it was sexually consummated, with a man named Jimmy Donahue, who was the Woolworths heir. He was a gay man, and there was some sort of love triangle between the Duke and the Duchess. I mean, all of this is been written about, and there's much speculation about it. I didn't even really get into my lecture about the other prevailing rumor about Wallace, which came out in a book that Anne Seba wrote a few years ago, that Wallace may have been born with a disorder of sexual development, a term which covers a whole spectrum of conditions from subtle sexual uncertainty through to hermaphroditism, a mismatch between the outer gender indicators and inner reproductive organs. It's a condition that apparently affects 1 in 15,000 births. Now, there's no hard evidence of this. Wallace was buried without an autopsy. She lies at Frogmore Cottage on the grounds of, which actually now is the home of Meghan and Harry in England. It still belongs to them. So, I mean, what I find more interesting about this is just, I think the rumors persist. And I think the reason why we are so fascinated by this is because all the answers to this point in history, this great development in history, lie in the psychology of these two people. And on the surface, there's not enough to explain it. Why did he give up the throne for this particular woman? It all comes down to the things in the shadows, and his personality, his frustrations, what happened behind closed doors. So I don't think we'll hear those rumors tamper down, and they'll probably continue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, you mentioned the psychological dimension to this, and the efforts to speculate about the psychology of Edward and Wallace. And
yeah,
that
people want a reason. Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that relates a bit to the next question we have from Diana Krawczyk, who writes in, both Edward and Wallace can be viewed as tragic. Both Victoria and Edward can be viewed as tragic figures in love stories that invalidate them as functional royals and arguably human beings. I sense this will be a motif that reappears through future royal romantic relationships. Is this a result of the position or the psychology associated with royalty? Have royals always struggled to balance their personal relationships with their public duties, or is this mostly a modern affliction of the crown?
Yeah, and I think she goes on to ask, what role did the media play in shaping the romantic relationships? And I would take a more sort of aerial perspective on this, and I think the media, in fact, just reflected social mores of the time. I think that's what's interesting about following the lives of the royals, because there's this sort of ping pong effect between the times they were living in, how they were shaping the times, and how the times were shaping them. Like, in terms of this sort of this conflict between duty and family and love and, you know, personal satisfaction, I don't think that's specific to the royals. I mean, all you have to do is go and look at Jane Austen's novels and see how Pride and Prejudice plays out. This idea of love and matrimony being connected is an actually relatively modern phenomenon. It goes back to the 18th, 19th centuries, comes out of the American and French revolutions. I mean, up until fairly recently, during the span of time, marriage was about the joining of, you know, different families, about estates, and a matter of duty. People fell in love, of course, but that wasn't necessarily what marriage was about. And I think the crux of the story of Edward picking Wallace over his family, picking Wallace over his duty, is one that resonates because you see it play out in many ways. Like right now, you probably see it play out in places like India, where like, depending on, where you live on the subcontinent, there is this inbred idea of like doing what your family wants you to do and arranged marriages. I was even thinking how the plot of Crazy Rich Asians, both the book and the film are about this. It's about like doing what the family wants you to do, what is good for the broader clan versus your own personal satisfaction. So yes, I mean, I think we see this play out with the royals. And then more recently in the lives of the royals, you see how things have softened in terms of men and within the Windsor family being able to choose who they want, and there being much less pushback, as we've seen out play with both William and Harry.
Mm-hmm. So Shinan, our next question comes in from Gary Lewis, who wrote in with a fascinating anecdote regarding Edward Wallace and the great photographer Richard Avedon that he wanted to hear your thoughts on. I wonder if you could read this anecdote for us, and then we'll jump into the question.
Yeah, it's a pretty good one. So Avedon, one of the most famous photographers of all time, tells a story about the day he took Edward and Wallace's portrait in Paris. He said he found them to be very cruel people whose only redeeming quality was their love of animals. And he describes how, in order to get the couple to drop the barrier, the mask that they were presenting to him, he told them a story about how on his way to their apartment, he'd just seen a dog get struck by a car. And in that precise moment, the couple reacted to that story. He snapped his famous portrait of them, was able to capture their humanity and the sadness behind the mask that they showed to the world. What do you make of that story? Now, I mean, it's one anecdote. It's literally one snapshot in the span of a life. So what can we really take of it? Do I think that these two didn't suffer fools? Yes. Do I think that they had like chips on their shoulders? You bet. And was Edward a snob? Yeah, in a way, like an ex-king probably inevitably would be. I think when it comes down to Edward and Wallace, there was definitely both like light and shade, like you find with most sort of interesting characters in histories. I do think that they created a prison of their own making, and they only really had each other. So everyone else was on the outside and sort of kept at bay. Did Wallace have a fairly sharp, if even cruel, sense of humor? We've seen that, but we've also seen many different reports from people who knew them about her being a wonderful hostess and her being one of the wittiest people that they'd ever met. So were they for everyone? Probably not. But were they evil? Capital Eve? Probably not either.
Okay.
I'll leave it at that.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a nice way of putting light and shadow for sure. So Shinan, we're running out of time here, but I know there is one sort of theme that you're very interested in that we didn't quite have a chance to touch on in this week's lecture, and that's the matter of the Duchess as she was nearing her death and how she may have been taken advantage of by her lawyer. Do you want to quickly offer that interesting coda to this story before we wrap up?
It is indeed a very interesting coda to the story, and in line with many other stories we've read about society, about wealthy people being taken advantage of, in their old age. I encourage people to go and look this up. But generally speaking, in the final years of the Duchess's life, she was frail and bedridden to a large extent. The Duke had died at this point. And a year after the Duke did die, the Windsor's Parisian lawyer, a woman named Suzanne Blum, whose husband had been their French lawyer until his death, persuaded Wallis to take over all their legal affairs. And what followed was what many people, including her personal secretary, now says. Personal secretary is actually still living. She's one of the few people who's still living who knew them intimately. She says that she got the Duchess to sign over the jewelry, which then led to the famous Sotheby's sale of her jewelry, which is played out in the Madonna film, W.E. That's what a lot of that film is about the jewelry, that apparently the Duke and Duchess wanted the jewelry to go back to the royals, to go back to England anyways. She also told Suzanne told the Duchess that the French government would make her leave the house where the Windsors lived rent and tax free unless she bequeathed everything to the Louis Pasteur Institute. And she was totally menacing and somewhat Machiavellian. So anyways, that's just a teaser for what happened. I encourage people to go look this up and read other biographies. But it is an interesting and sad end to the story. I appreciate everyone joining us today. I believe we may have lost Will, but that ends our session today, and we will be back next week with more royal juice. Thank you.